upon a time. As soon as we hear these words, many of us are immediately transported back into our childhood when we were told stories of magical spells, princes in disguise, and beautiful castles. No matter when and where we were raised, we have all, at one point or another, heard a fairy tale. Fairy tales have been around for hundreds, maybe even thousands of years. They have been passed down through countless generations using the oral tradition, and in the past few hundred years, they have been recorded in literature as well. In order to fully understand the importance of the fairy tales, we must explore exactly what fairy tales are, their essential elements, their history, how they are being used today, their positive and negative impacts, and finally, how and why fairy tales can be used with children in schools. First, let us examine what a fairy tale is. Fairy tales are actually in a subcategory under the giant umbrella that is folklore. You can see on the screen there are many different categories of folklore, including nursery rhymes, folk tales, fables, myths, epics and legends, and folk songs. If we zoom in even further on the category of folk tales, which we will learn about in a little while from Beth, we can see that this is where fairy tales reside, among animal tales, tall tales, and noodlehead tales as well. Golda et al. Define fairy tales as being magical tales replete with supernatural beings. They include such beings as elves, trolls, ogres, dragons, and even fairies. They also include some humans as well, including the youngest son, the wicked stepmother, and maybe even a stepsister or two. The big difference that truly makes fairy tales different from all the other aspects of folk tales is the deeply magical character that intervenes and makes things happen. Immediately, I think of Cinderella and the fairy godmother. Cinderella would never have made it to the ball had the fairy godmother not intervened and given her the means to do so. So that's a good way to remember what makes fairy tales different. Golda et al. Also state that fairy tales show us an ideal version of life in which goodness is rewarded and greed and wickedness are punished. In order to understand fairy tales as a specific genre, we must understand some elements that are essential to their nature. There are always going to be magical elements in a fairy tale. It usually starts with once upon a time and typically ends with happily ever after. Children know this format and they expect everything to work out at the end because of that happily ever after expectation. Sometimes, however, in the Grimm versions particularly, things do not work out as expected. Usually fairy tales will teach a moral, and some of the originals, I thought this was very interesting, had elements of suffering and tragedy. For example, the very first version of The Little Mermaid, told by Hans Christian Andersen, did not have the happy ending of the mermaid turning into a human and marrying the prince. In fact, she committed suicide to save the life of her prince. So a little bit of a different version than we're used to. Of course, this was deleted for the Disney version as well. There are also some motifs present in fairy tales. Characters typically behave in very stereotypical ways, and this is good for our youngest readers because they can predict exactly what will happen. It's a familiar structure for them moving from beginning to end. There are usually magical objects, spells, curses, or wishes at the center of the plot, and there is always an underlying theme of good prevailing over evil. Fairy tales also have similar types of characters as well. Sometimes we might see the good mother character, which might show up as a fairy godmother. We might also see a bad mother, which might be a wicked stepmother or an old witch. And sometimes, I thought this was interesting as well, we might see a character that's characterized as the shadow, which is the evil underside of every human being. Typically, we see characters battling the forces of evil to ensure the survival of good above all else. Now that we've explored the definition and characteristics of fairy tales, we can discuss their history. Because fairy tales are part of the folk tale tradition, they started with oral language first. Our fairy tales, as we know them today, are the creation of literate collectors, editors, and authors working from the late 17th to the mid-19th century. They were originally written not for kids, but for aristocratic adults that would gather in salons and like to listen to them. They were meant to teach proper behavior, which, if you remember from Dr. Bigstucker's class, in the 16th and 17th century, this was not uncommon. It was all about how you would behave. In fact, the term conte de fées is a literal translation for fairy tale, meaning that it was used to offer moral instruction under the guise of fantasy. Again, from what we know, fairy tales, because they were fictional and they did not prepare their children for an early death, did not really meet their standards. They didn't want to introduce them to their children. Now let's learn about some of the giants of fairy tales. In the late 1600s, the most famous author of fairy tales was Charles Perrault. He's most famous for writing the version of Cinderella with which we're most familiar today, and that would be the Disney version. He's also famous for writing stories called Puss in Boots and The Little Red Riding Hood, and he really was the one who helped establish fairy tales in the familiar canon of the children's library. Another set of giants is, of course, the Brothers Grimm. In the 1700s and 1800s, fairy tales were used for a different purpose. They were no longer just used to teach moral instruction, and now they were used to help scholars learn about language and culture. Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm were two scholars who used fairy tales to discover that certain languages had common elements. If you think about the Germanic languages, all of them had a common element. That is because the Grimm's law discovered those common elements among all the different languages. And as they were studying the different cultures, they learned that fairy tales were a really unique way to preserve culture. And being German, they wanted to preserve German culture. So they collected their fairy tales into 2 volumes called Children's and Household Tales, and it included such stories as Rumpelstiltskin, Rapunzel, and the Frog Prince. They also had a less moral tone in their versions, which was different from the earlier versions of the fairy tale. We're now actually going to take a few minutes to listen to one of the Grimm's versions of the fairy tale, The Frog Prince. Have you ever promised to do something that you really desperately did not want to do? Well, I know I've been in that situation, and I'm sure all of you have been in that situation as well. Royalty is no different. This is the story of the Frog Prince. Once upon a time, there was a king who had many beautiful daughters, and the youngest of his daughters was the most beautiful. In fact, she was so beautiful that the sun chose to shine on her more than anybody else, because she was just so beautiful when her hair had that golden glint from the sun. And near the castle where she lived, there was a small forest, and in the forest there was a well. And what she would do is she would sit next to the well on hot days because it was surrounded by a tall grove of trees, and no matter where you sat in that tall grove of trees, you would keep cool from the hot sun. And so as she was sitting next to the well, what she would often do is she would take her golden glittering ball, which was her favorite possession, and she would throw it up in the air over and over again just to pass the time throughout the day. But as you might expect, one day as she was throwing the ball over and over again, she dropped it into the well. She peered into the well and she looked, but she couldn't see anything. It was too dark, too deep. It would just look like blackness to her. So, being a princess, what could she do? She had to sit next to the well and cry. All of a sudden, she heard a voice emerge from the well. And the voice said, "Youngest princess, why are you crying? Your tears could melt a heart of stone." She looked to her left, she looked to her right, she looked up, and then she looked down, and what she saw in the well was the head of an ugly, old, horrid, woolly-faced frog staring back at her. And seeing that no one else was around, she decided that the frog must have been the one who was talking to her. And so she said, "Oh, Frog, is that you talking to me? I'm crying because I lost my ball in the well and I just don't know what to do." Well, the frog was no dummy. He saw this as an opportunity. And he said, "No, princess, I can retrieve this ball for you. I can dive into the well and I can get it back for you, but you have to do something for me in return." Well, the princess wanted the ball back more than anything, so she offered all the finest gowns she owned, her pearls, her jewels, the crown on her head, anything this frog wanted. But the frog wanted something else entirely. He wanted to be her companion. And so he said, "Princess, I will retrieve this ball for you if you take me into your fine castle, let me sit at your dinner table, allow me to eat from your golden plate and drink from your silver cup, and then when I'm all done, I would like to go upstairs and sleep on your princess bed here I'm done." Well, the princess decided, okay, I'm going to promise this, but I have no intention of fulfilling this promise. So she agreed to the frog's terms, and he dove down into the well, and he retrieved the golden ball for her, and when he emerged, she snatched the ball away from him, and she ran all the way back to the castle, and the frog tried to hop to keep up with her, but his little frog legs could just not keep up with her. So she slammed the door of the castle and went back to normal, and the frog hopped back to the well. The next day, the princess was eating dinner at her table with her sisters and the king and the entire court, and all of a sudden, they heard 3 loud knocks at the door. And then they heard a loud yell come from the door saying, "Youngest princess, let me in!" Well, Princess walked over to the door. She opened the door, and when she opened the door, what did she see but the little, old, horrid, ugly frog sitting there. She slammed the door, and she ran back to her seat, and she acted very nervous. And the king noticed this, and he said, "Youngest daughter, what's the matter?" And the princess started to tell the story of how she had promised this frog all these things and then had broken the promise by running away. And the king said, "Youngest daughter, that which you have promised, you must perform." So she hung her head, and she went back to the door, and she opened it, and she picked up the frog and carried him back to the table where he sat with them and ate dinner. And he wanted to eat off the same plate as her. And when that wasn't enough, he wanted her to scoot her goblet closer so that he could drink out of the same goblet as she did. And when she was all done, and when he was done as well, he said, "I'm tired now. Please take me up to your room so that I may sleep on your silken pillow." Well, this was too much for the princess. She started to cry. She did not want an old, ugly, warty frog on her pillow. And the king saw this, and he lost patience with her. He said, "Youngest daughter, that which you have promised, you must perform." So she took the frog between her finger and her thumb, and she carried him up the stairs with a look of revulsion on her face. And she tried to place him into the corner of the room, but he wasn't having it. He said, "Princess, you have promised to put me on your pillow, and if you don't, I will tell your father." So the princess placed the frog on her silken pillow, where he promptly fell asleep. The princess was so distraught at having this ugly creature in her bed that she cried herself to sleep as well. But when she woke up the next morning, she was met with a very interesting surprise, for on her pillow was no longer the ugly frog, but a handsome prince with very kind eyes. And she got up in alarm. This was not who was in the room before. And she said, "Who are you?" And he explained that he was the frog, and a curse had been placed upon him many, many years ago. And it would only be broken if someone with an honorable heart fulfilled all their promises. And so, the princess had done just that and broken the spell. Of course, they fell in love right away. And the king offered his permission for them to get married, and they lived, as you might expect, happily ever after. From that day forward, the princess offered the king sage advice to anyone who would listen. That which you have promised, you must perform. And from this day forward, anybody who fulfills their promises is honorably rewarded. Another giant of fairy tales is Hans Christian Andersen. He was born in Denmark, and his dad was a shoemaker, and his mother was deeply superstitious. He grew up listening to the tales of the Arabian Nights, and so fairy tales were really a part of his childhood. Books were always treasured in his family, and so some of the stories that he created were actually autobiographical in nature. They came from his childhood, and some he created on his own. Some of his most famous stories are The Ugly Duckling, The Little Match Girl, and The Little Mermaid. He published his first collection of fairy tales in 1835, and really he achieved lasting fame after they were translated to English. He was famous in Denmark, but he achieved much more fame once his stories were translated. He published 21 collections of tales by 1870, and he's known for adding his own creative touches to his tales, although sometimes when they're translated, they lose a bit of that creative touch. Since fairy tales have obviously not gone away over the last few hundred years, we will now take a look at how they are seen in modern times. Disney is really credited for giving fairy tales new life. You can see a few of the classics on the screen. Cinderella, made in 1950, is actually based on Charles Perrault's original version, and